When it comes to fishing freshwater, stillwater environments, there's two fundamentally different types of water we can fish: natural lakes and reservoirs. And we're going to talk about the difference between fishing those two on this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. I'm Chad LaChance, and you're listening to Fishful Thinker, the podcast. All things fishful, all the time. Hey guys, Chad LaChance here. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. Of course, brought to us each week by the fine folks at Sportsman's Warehouse. You can visit them at sportsmans.com or any one of 140 plus stores nationwide, as we often do in our travels. And also for your Northern Colorado thinkers, don't forget the fine folks at Peterson Toyota. They've serviced all of our Toyota stuff for the last 20 years, including all my Tundras and GT86 and the other cars as well. So guys, here we are in September. I just got back from a wonderful, absolutely fantastic road trip to Minnesota and fishing with one of my favorite guys, Dan Swanson, and of course traveling with cameraman Tim Farnsworth, and once again had an epic cross country. It's our fourth time going to Minnesota in the last 6 years. The other 2 years we've gone to South Dakota. And the reason I bring that up, each time, this time of year we do that. And the reason I bring those trips up is for one reason and one reason only. I am based in the Western United States, and the overwhelming majority of the water that I get to fish is a reservoir situation. When it comes to stationary water anyway, it's a reservoir situation. And I live in Colorado, and there's not a single natural lake in Colorado under 7,000 feet in elevation. And what that basically means is all the lakes up and down the Front Range of Colorado on the east and west slope are all reservoirs, meaning there's some sort of man-made environment. Flip side of it is, when you go to Minnesota or South Dakota, most of those lakes, or could be Wisconsin or many others as well, but most all of those lakes are natural lakes, meaning glaciers scraped the earth right there, left a deep spot, filled up with rainwater or groundwater, as the case might be, and a lake was born, and it lives more or less there on its own. Typically, they fish fundamentally different than reservoirs, and I thought we'd talk about that a little bit because it's actually a fairly common scenario that I run into in guiding people, is that they don't understand the difference. So they moved here from Minnesota, or they moved here from Wisconsin, or maybe upstate New York, something like that, and the fishing is just fundamentally different, and they don't understand where that fundamental difference lies, for one, in terms of catching, and then for two, the other common scenario I see and hear and discuss with people all the time is the differences in balance of those two fisheries. And I mean balance, I'm referencing population balance. And that's a big one we see, particularly here in Colorado, Wyoming, sometimes western Kansas as well, where anglers don't fully understand the difference in managing a reservoir versus a natural lake. And at the end of the day, the biggest difference is that all of these reservoirs that we fish are basically giant fish tanks. There was no water there in the first place. There might have been a river that ran through there, but otherwise there was no water at all in the first place. And so right off the bat, that's an issue. So the floor of the body of water, the bottom has not had 1,000 years of evolution and all of that. The water that's there was never meant to be impounded there in the first place, so it may have weird chemical composition from wherever it came from, which is the case of the water here in my home reservoir. The other thing is, none of the fish species were born there or are from there. So in the case of Colorado, almost none of the fish that we target are native to our state in the first place. So there was no water. Then we built a dam and made an artificial lake, and then we filled it up with fish that weren't ever from here. And then anglers don't understand why the walleyes and the pike don't exist well together here, or why the crappies don't reproduce at the levels that they do in some other places, or why largemouth bass don't do as good here as they would in some other places in terms of growing to sheer size, or whatever the case might be. At the end of the day, the whole ecosystem that they're counting on is completely non-native. And if you've ever had a fish tank, which is a tiny microcosm of what we're talking about, you know it requires more maintenance than if you just have a pond, and meaning that the water chemistry gets out of whack, the fish get out of whack, they outgrow their environment, they'll outcompete with each other. Fish that would normally get along fine will not get along fine in an enclosed environment, things like that. So there are key differences that you have to keep in mind as to why a reservoir in Colorado that contains the same species of fish as a lake in Minnesota does not fish the same or even close to the same. So I'll go through a couple of those points point by point, and we'll go from there. And the easy and obvious one is water level. The lakes in Minnesota, if they go up or down a foot, it's on the news. It's a big deal, a huge deal. The water level is basically stable most of the time. A couple inches one way or another, yeah, okay, that's their big change. Maybe a foot, holy moly, Mille Lacs is down a whole foot. Half the boat ramps aren't even usable anymore. Well, my home lake might go down more than a foot in one day, and it will certainly go down 5 feet in a week very easily. In fact, this week alone, it will probably go down 4 feet. So you're talking about a tremendous difference in water levels, which makes spots less consistent year in and year out. And that's one of the key things. So for instance, I was just in Minnesota, like I said. I could go back to the same patch of weeds that I caught fish in 3 years ago when I was in Minnesota, and that patch of weeds will still be there. There will still be a mix of cattails and lily pads and coontail underneath it and all that, and there will still be northern strain largemouth bass that are native to there that are living in that same patch of weeds. If I take a spot that's the same size, and that patch of weeds, maybe it's the size of my Tundra pickup, I go back to a spot the size of my Tundra pickup in Colorado 3 years later, and it might be 30 feet above the water, or it might be 30 feet below the water. Or if the water level's the same, there may have been significant erosion that occurred in between there. Or, you just don't know because the water has moved up and down a whole bunch. And so that's one of the key things. That makes fish move. It forces them to move more than they would normally move. And that's why your grandpa might have spots that are really, really good, that have been good his whole life if he's fishing back east, but it's very rare to find spots like that in reservoirs that fluctuate water levels like all of our water storage lakes do here in Colorado. So that's one of the key things right there, is that water level moving up and down. And it also leads to why I want to know always when I'm going to travel somewhere. I'm traveling this week to go film again, and the first thing I look up is where's the water level and how much is it moving and how fast is it moving. And I don't even really care a whole bunch about any of the other fishing conditions. I'll work that out when I get there. What I do care about is the water level moving. And I would expect that almost anywhere I'm going to fish right now this time of year in the West, the water level will be falling. And I want to know how fast and for how long, because if it's been falling really fast, I know that's going to position fish than if it's not really falling much at all and it's just creeping down. And that's going to, in most cases, depend almost strictly on how much water the crops that are around the reservoirs need. Most of the western reservoirs that are famous for fishing, or that we are likely to fish, are irrigation reservoirs. So if they need water, they pour it out on the crops, and that's what it is. And so knowing what that water level is doing will give me a best chance of predicting where I might be able to find my fish. And what does that mean? Well, if the water's dropping really fast, the first thing I'm going to be looking at is places that have either steeper banks or direct access to deep water. If it's falling really fast, I might look at inlets rather than outlets. If it's falling really fast, I will for sure look at dams, because they have typically an equal slope that goes all the way down to the basin of the lake, and the fish can move up and down that slope without fundamentally changing anything in their environment. So that's a key spot for me. It will always be a dam. Same thing with boat ramps, because they have access to the basin of the lake and they represent good spots to find fish. And then any sort of ditches that are submerged underneath, old channel swings, things like that, those tend to work well. And so conversely, if I know the water's not moving down very much, well, then I might not focus so much on the steep stuff. I might look at some big flats this time of year thinking, well, maybe there's bait fish up on the flats already, which is for sure occurring in some lakes around. And incidentally, even with the water dropping, some of those bait fish will still show up on those flats. It's just that they're going to be the flats with the best access to deep water. So they're not going to be 400 or 500 yards up on a flat a long ways from deep water. They're going to be 50 yards up on a flat that's not too far from deep water. So that's a key thing there. The other thing that the water level moving does, and this makes a big difference as well, and it's not the whole difference, but it's part of it. It's this kind of a two-part thing. Fluctuating water levels prevent weed lines, submerged weed lines, and or present them from being consistent year to year anyway. So one year the reservoir gets really high early in the year because we have plenty of snow and they fill the lake early. Lake's all the way full and it has time for some grass to come in, and typically here in Colorado we're going to get a lodia grass or something like that. The grass will start coming in. Well, then the water will drop, it'll kill the grass, and there won't be any more aquatic vegetation to fish at all. The following year, the water doesn't come in as early in the first place, and the grass never grows in the same spot that it grew before, because by the time the water gets up there, it's too late for that grass to bloom, and therefore it doesn't grow there at all. And in other years, the lake doesn't go down as fast as normal, and the grass gets really thick, and then when the lake starts going down, it folds over on the surface, and we have grass mats. And if you fish a place in my home area called Boyd Lake very much, those scenarios are all very common. One year, the lake's high and stable and all through spring and summer, and you get really, really pronounced grass mats. And the next year, the lake never even fills all the way up and the grass doesn't come in at all. And it fundamentally changes the lake. Conversely, you go to Minnesota or, like I said, South Dakota or any of the other lakes that are more consistent water level wise, they're also more consistent as far as their vegetation grows. So yeah, there's going to be still some variances depending on if there was late ice or just depending on what the weather was for the season or anything like that. It may change up the vegetation a little bit, but it's not going to be, at least in my experience, a giant, huge change where, oh my gosh, there's no coontail in this lake anymore, like there might be with American pondweed at Boyd Lake. So that's a key thing right there. And even more importantly than that, the bottom content of those natural lakes, because they've been lakes for a very, very long time, because they're naturally occurring, the bottom content has the natural nutrients and things around in there that helps promote the vegetation as well. Because as that vegetation dies off every year, there's more and more of the nutrients that go into the bottom of the lake. Whereas in the reservoir like I have here, well, it wasn't even built until the 1950s. So we're only talking about 70 years total of history that there's been a lake here, for one. For two, that environment was not conducive to anything aquatic in the first place. Where I live was effectively the high desert until they flooded it. So the mineral content of the natural earth right here is not what it would be to be conducive to growing vegetation either. So even if the lake was very stable, that doesn't mean that all the vegetation will still grow in here like it does in natural lakes. So you have to learn to be more flexible if you're going to fish reservoirs than if you're going to fish lakes. So that's one of the biggest statements that I could make of the whole thing. I have learned now in let's say the last 6 years, since I've been consistently going fishing natural lakes at least once a year, I have learned that I can count on certain weed lines, certain spots, certain areas of those lakes to always be good. Whereas being in the West and fishing reservoirs, for instance, my home reservoir that I've been fishing for 30 years, one area of the lake will be really good one spring, and the following spring, that whole area doesn't even fish well. It's just not consistent. And so you have to keep an open mind when it comes to the environment if you're going to be fishing in Western reservoirs, or really even Eastern ones if they move up and down a lot. And there's some as well. But the reason I don't mention them a whole bunch is I don't fish Eastern reservoirs a tremendous amount. So the overwhelming amount of my experience is back east. As far as eastern reservoirs, the farthest I've spent a whole lot of time is in the Ozarks. Spent a lot of time there, and I've got a fair bit of time on Kentucky Lake farther east. And in that case, Kentucky Lake moved a couple of feet up and down total as well. But again, it's a couple of feet, not a couple of dozen feet, like would happen here in my home lake. So the flexibility and the fishing with an open mind thing cannot be taken too lightly. And that even goes week to week, day in and day out. Like if you think about this, if let's say I was in Minnesota for 3 weeks, the only thing that would change the fishing fundamentally in a 3-week period there would be the weather itself, maybe a mild seasonal change, something like that. Otherwise, there's not going to be a change in a 2 or 3 week period of anything fundamental. I mean, storms will come through and change it day in and day out. Season might start progressing a little bit as water temperatures drop, and it'll move some fish a little bit. Okay, so yeah, there's some changes. It's enough to keep you on your toes, but not really. Whereas 2 or 3 weeks in my home lake might mean 15 feet of water plus. It might mean a huge difference in temperature change as well because of the water changing in levels that quickly. And it will maintain a fundamental difference in bottom content in a lot of cases as the water drops off the rocks and into the muddy basin of the lake. And so those things are all much more fundamental changes because they will occur over and above the same weather changes that will occur in Minnesota and the same seasonal changes that will occur in Minnesota. So there's just a lot more variables to deal with in a reservoir situation. And again, it will keep you humble as an angler and force you to fish with an open mind. And I've said many times, and some of you are going to hate me for this, but I've said it before, I think Western anglers that go back east find the fishing easy. Eastern anglers that come out west find the fishing difficult, and it's because we have more variables to deal with. The other thing we have to deal with here that's kind of strange in a lot of cases is we have species that were never meant to interact together in the same body of water and occupying the same place in the water column. So I could very easily, let's say I'm fishing a 3-inch gulp minnow in my home lake, right? That's about a standard of a lure for everything out there that there is. A 3-inch gulp minnow on a, say, an 1/8-ounce jig head, very standard rig for me. I could catch anything from a larger smallmouth bass to a crappie, to a green sunfish, to a bluegill. Okay, I would expect to find all of those fish in the same place, even back east. Okay, I might catch a walleye. Okay, yep, I would expect to see that there. Well, how about this? I might catch a rainbow trout, a brown trout, an Arctic char, or a splake, which is a hybrid of a brook trout and a lake trout, all in the same lake and in the same day, and in some cases without moving my boat, just changing the difference in my cast. So when it comes to food sources, you have a fundamental difference in the reservoirs as well because for instance, a famous scenario, largemouth bass love to eat stock or trout. Walleyes love to eat stock or trout. Well, in Minnesota, they're not going to encounter stock or trout. Largemouth bass in most of the country are not going to encounter stock or trout. And so those anglers that are used to those scenarios aren't going to deal well with big largemouth bass that are following 8-inch stock or rainbows in open water. So it's just a different scenario all the way around that you, again, I keep harping on this, but you have to keep an open mind as to what you're looking at right in front of you. What might be the various food sources, they're gonna mix up a whole bunch. Where fish might go as the water moves. The water will typically move enough at my home lake over the course of a day that it can reposition fish while you're on the water. So I could be on a guide trip that starts at 6 in the morning, and by 3 in the afternoon, we've lost 8 inches of water. And the places that were good fishing in the morning are not in the afternoon. Or conversely, in the spring, it might go the other way around. So you have to keep that mindset that fish are where you find them, not where you found them. They're where you find them right now. They're eating what they're eating right now because that might change fundamentally as well. It's a very common scenario. Let me give you an example. I pulled gill nets with Colorado Parks and Wildlife a few years back, and they were sampling walleyes specifically. But it's a gill net, so it's not really discriminate. It catches whatever swims through it as long as it's the right size. And they pulled, I think it was 8 or 9 walleyes out of basically one square yard of net, which is a lot of walleyes in that little small bit of net. Those walleyes range from like 18 to 28 inches long. the key thing, the takeaway from it, they were doing mercury sampling, lead sampling, age data, and a few other things on these fish. So those fish are immediately harvested, and then they're sampled. There's a federal biologist in the boat, or a federal, well, I don't know if he's a biologist, but a federal scientist of some sort. There's a CPW biologist in the boat, and they do all kinds of science on these fish while you're in the boat. It's actually very fascinating if you ever get a chance to do it. They'll pull the otolith bone out of the ear, they'll pull a scale, they'll pull stomach contents, they'll pull other parts of the fish for sampling this, that, and the other. And the stomach contents were the interesting part in relation to this conversation. And that was because of the 8 or 9 walleyes that were in that net right there, none of them had the same things in their gullet. None of them had the same things in their stomach. They weren't eating the same stuff. So match the hatch is like, no, wait, where do I start? One of them's full of 1-inch crayfish. One of them, it's got like 30 of them in there. The next one's got one crayfish that's 8 inches long, looks like a baby lobster in there. The next one's got a couple of stocker trout stuffed in there. Then one of them's got the classic shad. Then another one's got rainbow smell, and another one's got what amounts to roly-polies, little bugs in them. Yet they're all in the same net at the same night in the same spot on the lake. And in a natural lake, you're not going to see that level of variance. They're going to be more of the fish doing the same thing at the same time. And that is, from what I'm told, due to the fact that when the fish are born and they're learning to transition to full-size food sources, whatever was prevalent when that was the case is what they've learned to eat. And that may change with the water levels over the course of the year at the reservoir, whereas that doesn't change in a natural lake where everything there is naturally occurring. So I do want to point out this, because somebody's going to listen to this and say, oh, he's busting on Minnesota fishermen because they say it's easy in Minnesota. No, that's not true. I've had to work for my fish a lot in Minnesota. But to be honest with you, it's less variables to work out there than it is to work out here. There you have some additional variables in that there's more kinds of aquatic vegetation. You have the variable in that there's more lakes to fish. So, and they don't all fish the same, even though they're all natural. They all have different characteristics and personalities. But at the end of the day, there's more variables in Colorado, and certainly as time is considered, or in Kansas or Nebraska or Wyoming or Utah, as time is considered, there's a lot more variables. Stuff will change a lot quicker in a reservoir situation than it will in a natural lake situation. So my advice is this. If you are a guy that's coming out to the west to fish, and you're going to fish western reservoirs from back east, and you're used to Wisconsin, or you're used to Minnesota, or like I said, the Adirondacks, or all the natural lakes up in there, maybe the Finger Lakes or whatever. If you come here, you need to focus really hard on water levels and what they're doing, and not on single bait species, and perhaps not on single fish species. And you need to keep an open mind over the course of, let's say, a vacation week of fishing, more than others. And you can't count on the fact that if you get around fish, they'll bite well, because it could be other things in play, like the falling water that spooks them, or water chemical things that mess with them. Conversely, if you're say a Colorado guy like me, and you go back to Minnesota, understand that if you're not catching them, you're just flat not around them. They will typically bite, and you just don't have your act together to catch them. In the reservoir, they might just be shut down. In the lake, they can shut down too, but I'm always of the opinion that when I get in the natural lake, if I move around enough in the lake, I will find pockets of willing fish. And I've seen reservoir days where that's just flat not the case. You fish for hours and hours and never catch anything. But so far, and I'm going to knock on my big, beautiful wooden desk right now, so far on all my trips to South Dakota and Minnesota, if I focus on fundamental stuff, day one stuff, and move around with an open mind, inside weed edges, outside weed edges, fish the fundamental stuff, where the wind's blowing in, fish, choose your color selections by the book, things like that. If I really focus on fundamental stuff, I'm fine. I have seen many times in the West where you can basically take that book and throw it out the window completely, because the book wasn't written for a reservoir that's moving up and down a couple of feet a day, or a reservoir that's all of a sudden getting runoff that's blasting into it that's 30 degrees colder than the reservoir itself. Or conversely, that all of a sudden somebody opened the drain and the lake is now draining from the floor of the lake, where, things like that fundamentally change the water quality, stratification, things like that. So My advice is that, if you're coming here, fish with more of an open mind. If you're going there, fish with a ton of confidence that they will bite if you get around them and focus on the fundamentals, and you'll get them caught. So a little bit of a rambling podcast there, guys, but I just got back from Minnesota. I'm still giddy, and everything I just talked about in this podcast basically popped up there in spades, and it was fantastic. So also real quick, I want to apologize. A little bit under the weather. I'm not sure if it's allergies or what, but if my voice is messed up, that's what it is. I feel okay, but my sinuses are giving me a hard time. So thank you for listening. If you want to join the conversation at Fishful Thinker, we'd appreciate that. Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok. Of course, check out the YouTube channel and also Altitude Sports and World Fishing Network. So thanks for tuning in. This has been Fishful Thinker, the podcast.